I've seen a lot of people covering the subject of how BF5 has failed, and while I mostly agree with those people, I wanted to share a different take. I don't just want to talk about bugs and certain gameplay features that were poorly introduced, or even worse, just never came to the game. I want to talk about the deeper problems that prevented BF5 from ever truly succeeding. There are a lot of Battlefield players returning to older titles, and while I love games like BF3 and 4, I felt it best to compare BF5 to its direct predecessor. Both are historical titles set during the World Wars, and of course they are the most recent additions to the franchise. But both games are very different and were received very, very differently by the fan base, so today I wanted to analyze just how Battlefield 5 failed, where Battlefield 1 succeeded. Before we start, make sure that if you enjoyed the video, you leave it a nice, juicy, and delicious like, and if you want more content like this, then be sure to subscribe. As I said in the intro, these games are very different, despite being historically set Battlefield titles, and this contributes to the question at hand. How did BF5 fall short, where BF1 knocked it out of the park? Well, for starters, let's look at how these games are presented, because this is where we can see the most obvious differences in these two games. Battlefield 1's reveal trailer is fast-paced. It presents the era in a very clear way and sets the tone for the game. World War I was brutal and unforgiving for the millions who participated, and that is shown off beautifully in every BF1 trailer. Then you have the initial gameplay reveal. A soldier in the Harlem Hellfighters, which is a detail that will be important later, so keep that in mind. He is suffering presumably from PTSD or shell shock, and he awakens from a nightmare of his time on the Western Front. This is followed by a black screen with a text giving an overview of the war and the somber words, "You are not expected to survive." The vision is clear for this game, and it's a huge reason why it was received so well. Then you have Battlefield 5's presentation. I'm sure I don't have to say much about how disappointed many of us fans were with the reveal and marketing, but looking back, it is fascinating just how unclear the setting really is. I mean, you have prosthetics and female soldiers at the very forefront, details like British soldiers having a Japanese katana in early war Europe, and until you see a BF-109 crash landing, the image that this is a World War II game just is not very clear, and it left a lot of fans kinda confused after the reveal trailer. Then DICE revealed the initial direction. This will be World War II as we've never seen it. This didn't sit well with many fans. People enjoyed the gritty and authentic atmosphere of Battlefield 1, and to follow that up with a wacky version of World War II just was not very appealing. After the backlash of the reveal, the photos of the reveal party that sparked massive controversy, an EA exec calling fans uneducated, and the don't like it, don't buy it fiasco, the team at DICE decided to dial back the wackiness a bit and presented a more World War II-like game at launch. The problem was it still didn't look or feel like an epic World War II experience that one would expect from the company that had just produced a game like Battlefield 1. Instead of the grim and ugly nature one would expect from a game set during the largest conflict mankind has ever known, we got a more sunny, almost lighthearted version of the war. This is where I want to talk about vision and dive a little deeper. Battlefield 5 is afraid to take responsibility for its vision. Obviously, this has something to do with the marketing of the game, as there was huge fan backlash to the reveal trailer and the initial ideas that DICE had presented. But even throughout the game's lifecycle, it makes changes or presents things that counter the supposed vision of the game. There are obvious examples of all of these, like the tacked-on Battle Royale mode that no one asked for and lost support after a whole 2 months. The Pacific coming out, and I'm not complaining about it, but it ignored the whole untold stories aspect of BF5 and took us to the most iconic locations of the Pacific Theater. Again, it's not a bad thing, just an example of how the vision of this game changed. But the attempts to change the TTK twice during the game's lifecycle have to be the greatest offenders to this issue. The gunplay was one of the bright spots in the game. It was lethal and simple to understand, but it took practice to master with each weapon. So when news of TTK changes came, it was not received well and was against the player base's wishes, as this game was supposed to be a more hardcore, unforgiving title. Slowing down the TTK conveniently around the holidays with the idea that it would prevent churn with newer players in the game was a big mistake, as the people in charge at DICE didn't seem to understand why this churn was actually happening. Anyone who has played the game would tell you that it was the poorly balanced vehicles, poorly received grand operations, poor visibility, mechanics that sounded cool on paper but were actually not very good for gameplay, or just didn't come to the game at all, and most of all, bugs. All of this caused player backlash and criticism, so DICE promised not to change the TTK again, and you can guess what happened. They changed it again a year later at the same time of year. This is in counter to Battlefield 1. who did have one TTK change in its life, but overall the change was well received as it was intended to make the game more lethal, in keeping with the vision of the deadliness and hopelessness soldiers of the Great War had. The grim maps and apocalyptic feeling in every match was perfect for what this game was supposed to be. I think the best example of the incredible execution of this vision is with the operations mode that was first introduced with BF1. It had the linearity of Rush with the scale of conquest and was a wonderful bastion of chaos to jump into, but that wasn't the only thing that made this mode so popular. The pre-game cutscenes add weight and humanity to this mode. Different soldiers giving their perspectives on the battle you're about to fight in adds a human touch that isn't seen in many other multiplayer shooters, while also teaching the player a little bit about the stakes at hand for the actual battles that took place over 100 years prior. Just take a listen.
It seems remarkable that in order to get our dreadnoughts running, we have to travel all the way to the Persian Gulf ourselves. Frankly, it's bewildering that such a valuable resource should be buried in the bloody desert. That said, these Ottoman savages shouldn't be too hard to clear out. You know, I'm half tempted to get stuck into the champagne already. But then, what would I have to look forward to in victory? Tea?
Bazılarına göre imparatorluğumuzun sonu geldi. Ancak biz ateş gibiyiz. Yeniden alevlenmemiz için bir kıvılcım yeter.
Them devils ain't so tough. Us boys will knock out their fortifications easy.
Break this Hindenburg line and finish this war. French been fighting for 4 years. They say just 4 minutes up against these fortified German lines and we look just like them. Yeah, like an army of living dead.
So muss das Ende der Welt aussehen. Mir tun die armen Tommys in ihren Gräben beinahe leid, wie sie versuchen, das alles zu verstehen.
This sits in opposition to Battlefield 5's grand operations, which seemed like a great idea on paper and were heavily marketed for this new game. But unlike BF1's operations, it was executed poorly. Instead of emotional cutscenes, they opted for the white text on a black screen trope that set the somber tone for the Storm of Steel gameplay reveal in BF1. While this does give the player an idea of what battles are happening, it doesn't have the personal touch that the cutscenes have in BF1. It leaves out that bit of authenticity. Now I could go into how these modes differ and how BF5's grand operations could be greatly improved by making it only 2 mandatory days where the third day is a best of 3 tiebreaker and we could actually see final stand for once, and how this would make the mode feel less on rails and add a competitive element that is similar to but not the same as BF1. But I made a whole video about that already, so watch that after this one, and instead I want to talk about authenticity and how this exposes the greater differences in these two games. First of all, let's explain historical authenticity and accuracy. In some ways I could argue that Battlefield 5 is more accurate than Battlefield 1. It features machine guns that can only be used effectively if mounted, attrition where resources can be limited, animations that make you more cautious when reviving teammates or bailing on vehicles because it takes time to do those things, but it's not authentic. So what do I mean when I say authenticity? What defines that? Well, authenticity is literally defined as the quality of being authentic, so there's not much to go off of here. While it can be somewhat subjective, I don't think many people would argue against the fact that BF1 is not very historically accurate, but many people can agree that the game is authentic. It doesn't operate how the First World War did, being more mobile in its gameplay, and it features weapons that largely were not used in the war. But because it puts fun over accuracy, and because the atmosphere looks and feels how someone could imagine the Great War being, it comes across as historically authentic. The uniforms are authentic to the armies. The Indian, African, and Anzac troops are appropriately represented by the armies who utilize them. Even the women fighting for the Imperial Russian Army are authentic. The weapons may have been experimental or rarely used, and you can argue about percentages of the army and representation, but you can't deny that BF1 authentically presents World War I in a way that is appealing and does a great job presenting the entire conflict. Battlefield 5 does almost the exact opposite. It adds in mechanics like MMGs and anti-material rifles that are only effective while prone or mounted. Combining this mechanic with the lack of 3D spotting for the hardcore vision they wanted made for a sacrifice of fun for realism, which caused many frustrating moments for most of the game's life. This, along with limited health regeneration and spawning with less than maximum ammo, made for a campy game where you frequently had to run to ammo and health stations before returning to your campfire. Now I will say I did like the idea of customization. It was one of the most requested features after BF1 lacked any soldier customization. Problem was that it was wacky and featured very few authentic World War II uniforms. This was odd considering there were so many options for DICE to choose from that would have been authentic and also very, very popular. One of the best examples is the Fallschirmjäger uniform from the pre-order bonus. Aside from the helmet, this is not a Fallschirmjäger uniform. This wouldn't be a problem if an actual authentic version was added for someone who wanted this as their soldier, but it never came. Then there's the authentic uniform colors and camouflage that only came to the game very recently. These seem like they should have been easy ones for DICE. You can tell the untold stories of World War II and still give the soldiers their authentic look, but it would not be the case for 95% of the game's life cycle. This lends to the lack of a World War II feeling. It has the weapons and vehicles of the Second World War, but it just doesn't feel like the war. The atmosphere doesn't capture you, particularly on the launch maps. While they wanted to tell the untold stories and go to never-before-seen locations, the maps feel generic. Sure, some iconic locations would have been nice and possibly added to this atmosphere as they did when the Pacific launched, but Battlefield 1 doesn't have this problem despite being set in a war that is not nearly as popular and is spoken of far less. In fact, many of the maps that launched with BF1 do not feature the more iconic battles of the First World War. While they are notable, they are not as major as some of the DLC locations like the Somme, Verdun, and Passchendaele. Yet the atmosphere is still incredible. It captures the player and it feels like World War I. One thing Battlefield 1 does so phenomenally is tell all of the stories of the First World War. While it does leave out things like German East Africa and the Japanese taking of Central Power colonies in the Pacific, it does feature the major combatants and locations of the conflict. But it doesn't just feature the major battles. It also portrays the lesser-known stories and does so with care and authenticity. The Harlem Hellfighters grace the cover and feature in the introductory campaign mission, while a female Russian soldier is also featured on the Revolution edition of the game. BF1 also ventures into conflicts like the Russian Revolution of 1919, and represents the few British units there to aid the Imperial Russian faction with Mark IV tanks. It captures the entirety of the war with respect to those who fought, while also allowing players to have fun in one of the greatest atmospheres in any multiplayer shooter ever. All this and I haven't even touched the war stories yet, which despite the unorthodox campaign of several small anthologies depicting each theater of the war, it did capture many fans and was praised for being able to give a glimpse into different perspectives of each theater. From the elite Arditi forces in the mountains of Italy to the muddy, bloody, and downright unreliable tanks on the Western Front, you got to see a wider perspective of a war that most think of as some British guys standing in trenches across from some German guys in trenches. Instead, we see stories like those of the Anzac troops fighting the Ottomans in the failed invasion of Gallipoli, or the mischievous actions of a pilot over the skies of Europe. And most iconic of all, we get to fight alongside the near-mythical figure of Lawrence of Arabia and his freedom fighters in the desert. The stories are short but worth every second and do a wonderful job of presenting the war. Battlefield 5 also uses this war story formula, and while some are better than others, you can tell it can't keep its vision straight. First of all, the best war story didn't come to the game until after launch, and that is The Last Tiger. It tells the somber story of a German tank crew in their last futile attempts to hold back the Allies in a fearsome Tiger tank. The characters are well acted and the story is truly captivating as these seasoned veterans question the motives behind the war effort. But then you have Under No Flag, which goes in the opposite direction, with some strange comedy and moments like blasting music over a radio while you single-handedly do a final stand against German armored columns. It really is the oddball of the bunch.
I'm sick! I'm chucking me guts up over here! Oh. And you're just strolling off!
In the middle are two more, Tirlor and Nordlies. I have to say I did enjoy Tirlor. It's emotional and it shows the adversity colonial troops faced fighting for their empires. Not to mention the setting of southern France is beautiful. I still wish that one map was turned into a true multiplayer map. Of all the war stories, this one and The Last Tiger came closest to BF1 in terms of quality. Nordlies is an odd one though. It's a story about a Norwegian resistance fighter trying to rescue her mother and destroy the German heavy water facility that is in place to create an atomic bomb. This is an entirely fictional story based off of a real event where Norwegian commandos in Operation Gunnerside destroyed the Vemork heavy water plant for the same reasons as in the war story. While the Nordlies war story isn't particularly bad and the ability to ski around is quite fun, I found it odd that instead of telling an actual untold story of World War II, they just made up a story. In general, the war stories are again indicative of the unclear vision for the game. Two are quality tellings of unique perspectives of the war. One is a meme, and another borders on historical revisionism. I just don't know how they got so much so wrong in Battlefield 5. The core mechanics are fun, but World War II as a setting and a first-person shooter should be the easiest slam dunk of a game possible. The only way to mess it up is to get in your own way, and that's what I think DICE did. Battlefield 1, on the other hand, is an example of a quality vision executed properly. Whether you agree with that vision and its gunplay or the Ilya Muromets existing in-game is up to you, but it is a great game with a clear path that was followed. Battlefield 5 does not follow a clear path. It builds the track in front of the speeding train, and it doesn't look where it's going. By the time it stops, everyone on board has jumped off, and that is how Battlefield 5 failed, where Battlefield 1 absolutely nailed it. Last, before we go, I just want to make myself clear. I don't hate Battlefield 5. I feel like the game had massive potential, but that potential was wasted. The Pacific update was the high point of the game, and that lasted just a couple of weeks before 5.2 happened. I wanted this game to do well. I believed in it when I maybe shouldn't have, and now with support ending, I can only hope that BF6 can be what brings the community back together again. Thank you all for watching.